Imagine smoke choking the air, the deafening roar of cannons, and the ground shaking beneath your boots. This wasn't strategy on paper. This was survival. You've seen the paintings, noble soldiers in pristine uniforms, standing heroically as they charge across perfectly manicured battlefields. The wounded lie peacefully as if they'd simply decided to take a nap in the middle of combat. These romantic images shaped how generations thought about the Civil War, but they couldn't be further from the truth. The reality? Picture a 19-year-old farm boy from Ohio, hands trembling as he tries to reload his rifle while his best friend screams beside him, clutching what's left of his shattered leg. The air is so thick with gunpowder smoke, you can't see 10 feet in front of you. The sound isn't just loud. It's a physical force that pounds your chest and leaves your ears ringing for days. And that ground beneath your feet? It's not grass anymore. It's mud mixed with blood and things you don't want to think about. Tonight, we're tearing away the romantic mythology to reveal what it was actually like to fight in the Civil War. Not the sanitized version you learned in school, but the raw, terrifying, and utterly transformative experience that changed every single man who lived through it. Because here's what nobody tells you about the deadliest conflict in American history. The real enemy wasn't always the guy in the different colored uniform. So brace yourself. We're about to walk in the boots of soldiers who thought they were signing up for glory and adventure, only to discover they'd volunteered for something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is the story they never put in the history books. The first thing you need to understand about Civil War soldiers is that they were nothing like modern military personnel. When war broke out in 1861, both sides were essentially playing dress-up with armies. The typical Union soldier was a slim young man barely over 5 feet 8, with brown hair and blue eyes. He was probably a farmer, probably Christian, and almost certainly had never been more than 20 miles from his hometown. More than 2 million soldiers were 21 or under when they enlisted. Kids, really, who thought war would be the greatest adventure of their lives. They called it seeing the elephant. This phrase originated from the exotic circus elephants that rarely visited small American towns. To have seen the elephant was something to brag about for years. These young recruits imagined combat the same way, exotic, thrilling, something that would make them the envy of everyone back home. They pictured themselves charging forward in those crisp uniforms you see in paintings, stepping gracefully over enemies who had fallen into dignified poses, routing the demoralized foe with individual acts of heroism. The Confederate soldiers looked remarkably similar to their Union counterparts, though they were even more likely to be farmers by trade. What united soldiers on both sides wasn't their politics or their cause. It was their complete and utter ignorance of what they were walking into. Because here's the brutal truth. The Civil War was the first truly modern war fought with medieval tactics. Soldiers were armed with rifled muskets that could accurately kill a man at 500 yards. But their commanders still ordered them to fight like it was the Napoleonic Wars. Picture this insanity. Thousands of men lining up shoulder to shoulder, marching in perfect formation across open ground toward an enemy who could pick them off from half a mile away. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except everyone had guns and nobody understood the rules had changed. The Springfield Model 1861 was the standard rifle of the war, 56 inches long, weighing 9 pounds, firing a .58 caliber bullet made of soft lead called a Minié ball. These weren't the clean, precise wounds you see in movies. When a Minié ball hit you, it expanded on impact, shattering bone and creating massive wound channels that were nearly impossible to treat. A trained soldier could fire 3 rounds per minute, but loading was a complex process that became a nightmare under combat conditions. You had to tear open a paper cartridge with your teeth. Imagine doing that when your hands are shaking with terror and adrenaline. Pour the gunpowder down the barrel. Ram the bullet down with a ramrod. Place a percussion cap on the firing mechanism, all while people are actively trying to kill you. At the Battle of Gettysburg, Union forces found 24,000 rifles that had been loaded multiple times without being fired. 18,000 of them had been loaded twice or more. That's how panicked and confused soldiers became in the chaos of battle. But before any of these farm boys ever saw a battlefield, they had to survive something almost as brutal, becoming a soldier in the first place. The transformation from civilian to soldier was like being thrown into a meat grinder of discipline and monotony. Theodore Garish described his first military march. It was a most ludicrous march. We had never been drilled. An untrained drum corps furnished us with music. Each musician kept different time, and each man in the regiment took a different step. We marched, ran, walked, galloped, and stood still in our vain endeavors to keep step. Day after day, it was the same grinding routine. As soldier Robert Watson documented, drilled in the afternoon, inspection of arms. Commenced drilling. Drill as usual morning and afternoon. Drilled and inspected our arms, quarters, etc. Hour after hour of marching in formation, learning to load and fire in unison, responding to bugle calls and barked orders. It seemed pointless, mind-numbing, designed to break their spirits. And maybe it was, because the dirty secret of military training is that it's not really about teaching you to fight. It's about teaching you to obey without thinking. When bullets start flying and men start dying around you, conscious thought shuts down. You fall back on training, on muscle memory, on the automatic responses drilled into you during those endless, boring hours in camp. The soldiers who survived weren't necessarily the bravest or the strongest. They were the ones who could function when their minds went blank with terror. Camp life dominated the Civil War soldier's existence far more than actual combat. For every hour spent in battle, soldiers spent weeks or months sitting around, waiting, dealing with the crushing boredom and petty irritations of military life. They woke before dawn to the sound of reveille, stumbled through roll call, choked down whatever passed for breakfast, then faced another day of drill, guard duty, equipment maintenance, and camp chores. Letter writing became a lifeline to their former selves. Soldiers would spend hours each week writing to family members, describing their experiences, and desperately seeking news from home. These letters were more than communication. They were proof that somewhere in some other world, they had been normal people with normal lives. Card games, particularly poker, became ubiquitous in camps, leading to constant gambling debts and disputes. Religious services provided spiritual comfort and a sense of normalcy, with chaplains playing crucial roles in maintaining morale and counseling homesick or traumatized soldiers. But nothing, no amount of drilling, no letters from home, no prayers or card games could prepare these young men for the reality of Civil War combat. Because when that first battle came, everything they thought they knew about war, about heroism, about themselves, was about to be shattered forever. The violence was beyond anything in American military experience. Artillery rounds didn't just kill, they obliterated. Solid shot could decapitate multiple soldiers in a single impact. Canister shot turned cannons into giant shotguns, clearing entire sections of battle line in seconds. Shrapnel tore off heads, smashed away jaws, crushed features, ripped off limbs, opened up stomachs and abdomens, exposed beating hearts. This wasn't the clean, dignified death of storybooks. This was industrial-scale carnage that turned human beings into unrecognizable fragments. And the sounds, dear God, the sounds. The screaming wasn't just from pain. It was from men who had suddenly understood that everything they believed about war, about honor, about glory, was a lie. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lived long enough to understand what was happening to them. John Opie of the 5th Virginia Infantry described a field hospital after the Battle of First Manassas. There were piles of legs, feet, hands, and arms all thrown together, and at a distance resembled piles of corn at a corn shucking. Many of the feet still retained a boot or shoe. Wounded men were lying on tables, and surgeons, some of whom at the time were very unskillful, were carving away like farmers in butchering season, while the poor devils under the knife yelled with pain. 3 out of every 4 surgical procedures performed during the war were amputations. Each amputation took between 2 and 10 minutes to complete. The sight of piles of severed limbs outside surgical tents became one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of Civil War medical treatment. Walt Whitman, working as a nurse, saw a heap of amputated feet, legs, arms, hands, etc., a full load for a 1-horse cart, and several dead bodies lying nearby. But here's the thing that really breaks your heart. These weren't hardened professional soldiers. These were neighbors, friends, brothers who had enlisted together from the same small towns. The Civil War's regimental system meant entire units were recruited from the same geographic areas. When Johnny from down the road got his leg blown off, it wasn't just another casualty. It was someone you'd grown up with, someone whose mother made you cookies, someone who'd helped you bring in the harvest. This created bonds of brotherhood unlike anything in modern warfare, but it also amplified trauma in ways that would echo through these men's lives for decades. Because when your best friend dies screaming in your arms, when you watch your cousin bleed out in the mud, when you see your neighbor's intestines spilling onto the ground, that changes something fundamental inside you. Something that can never be put back together. And then there was the waiting. Not the romantic pause before a heroic charge, but the gut-wrenching hours of knowing death was coming and being powerless to stop it. Picture this. You're crouched in a muddy trench at dawn, listening to the enemy moving in the darkness beyond. Your rifle is loaded, your bayonet fixed, and every muscle in your body is coiled like a spring. But you can't move, you can't run. You can only wait for some officer you've never met to blow a whistle and send you stumbling across that killing field. The psychological torture of anticipation was almost worse than the battle itself. Soldiers would lie awake the night before major engagements, writing what they thought might be their final letters home. Some would pray, others would vomit from pure terror. Many would simply stare into space, their minds already beginning to fracture under the weight of what was coming. When dawn finally broke and the orders came, something extraordinary happened to these young men. Their minds didn't shut down. They split. Part of them became a killing machine, following orders, loading, firing, advancing. But another part of them, the part that was still Johnny from the farm or Billy's from the general store, retreated deep inside where it could watch the horror unfold like a terrible dream. This psychological compartmentalization was the only way to survive. One soldier wrote to his sister, "There are feelings, tender feelings, down deep in the soldier's breast, which when moved will prove that all that is good is not quite dead." They had to bury their humanity to function as soldiers, but they lived in constant fear that they might never find it again. Because the real terror wasn't just dying. It was what you became when you didn't die. Every battle changed you. Every friend you lost took a piece of your soul with them. Every man you killed left a stain that no amount of prayer could wash clean. These farm boys who had never hurt anything bigger than a chicken found themselves doing things that would have been unthinkable just months before. The first time you killed someone, it was usually an accident of war, a volley fired into smoke, a bayonet thrust in the chaos of close combat. You might not even know you'd done it until later when the smoke cleared and you saw the body. But the second time was different. The second time, you looked into another human being's eyes and chose to end their life. And something inside you died with them. Veterans would later describe this transformation with a mixture of horror and fascination. They spoke of watching themselves commit acts of violence as if they were outside observers, powerless to stop what their hands were doing. The psychological term for this wouldn't be coined for another century, but Civil War soldiers were experiencing what we now know as dissociation, the mind's desperate attempt to protect itself from unbearable trauma. And the trauma wasn't just from combat. It was from everything. The constant exposure to death, the breakdown of civilized behavior, the slow erosion of everything they'd been taught about right and wrong. In a world where killing your neighbor had become a patriotic duty, where stealing food was called foraging, where leaving wounded enemies to die was standard practice, moral certainties crumbled like sandcastles in a hurricane. But perhaps the cruelest joke of all was that these psychological wounds were invisible. A man missing a leg got sympathy and a pension. A man whose mind had been shattered by what he'd seen and done was told to be grateful he'd survived and get on with his life. There were no words for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. no understanding that the human mind could be wounded just as surely as the human body. The physical conditions only made everything worse. While soldiers in the field dealt with the immediate terror of combat, those in camp faced a slower but equally deadly enemy, disease. Twice as many soldiers died from illness as from enemy bullets, and the statistics tell a story of suffering that makes battlefield casualties look merciful by comparison. Picture this. You've survived Antietam, Gettysburg, maybe even Pickett's charge. You've looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. Then you die of dysentery in a camp hospital, shitting yourself to death while your body slowly shuts down from dehydration and infection. There's no glory in that death, no heroic last words, just the slow, humiliating dissolution of everything that made you human. The camps themselves were breeding grounds for every disease known to medical science, and several that weren't. When you take thousands of young men who've lived isolated rural lives and cram them together in makeshift shelters with no understanding of basic sanitation, disease spreads like wildfire. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, and especially typhoid fever raced through regiments, killing more effectively than any Confederate or Union bullet. The hygiene was medieval. Soldiers shared drinking water with horses and mules. They relieved themselves wherever convenient, often contaminating the same streams they drank from. Lice were so common they became pets, with soldiers naming their favorite specimens and holding races. One veteran recalled, "We lived in a persistent state of filth that would have horrified our mothers and made our sweethearts faint." Medical care, when available, was often worse than no care at all. Field surgeons, many of whom had never performed major operations before the war, learned their trade on the bodies of wounded soldiers. They operated without understanding infection, using the same instruments on patient after patient without cleaning them. A minor wound could easily become a death sentence through medical incompetence rather than battlefield trauma. The winter months brought their own special hell. While popular imagination focuses on the dramatic battles, soldiers spent most of their time simply trying not to freeze to death. They lived in flimsy tents that provided virtually no protection from wind, rain, or snow. Their single wool uniforms, the same uniforms they wore year-round, became sodden death traps that never truly dried. Water leaked through canvas roofs or flowed across the ground into tents, flooding shelters with inches or feet of freezing water. Soldiers' bodies and possessions became drenched, interfering with their ability to sleep and forcing them to live in a persistent state of wetness that lasted for days or weeks. Frostbite was common. Pneumonia was epidemic. Men literally froze to death in their sleep, found rigid in their bedrolls by their tent mates in the morning. Summer brought different torments. Those heavy wool uniforms became ovens in the southern heat. Soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion during forced marches, their bodies unable to cool themselves while loaded down with equipment. The smell in camp became overwhelming. Thousands of unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, and the sickly sweet stench of gangrene from the hospital tents. Food, when there was any, was barely edible. Union soldiers subsisted on hardtack, a brick-hard cracker that had to be soaked in coffee or soup before it could be chewed, and salt pork that was often rancid. Confederate soldiers had it worse, surviving on whatever they could forage, steal, or capture from Union supply lines. By the war's end, many Southern soldiers were wearing uniforms stripped from dead Yankees, their own having long since rotted away. One Confederate sergeant noted, "Nearly all equipment in the Army of Northern Virginia were articles captured from the Yankees. Most of the blankets were those marked U.S., and also the rubber blankets or cloths. The very clothing that the men wore was mostly captured, for we were allowed to wear their pants, underclothing, and overcoats. This wasn't just poverty. It was the complete breakdown of the logistical systems that keep armies functioning. Soldiers learned to become scavengers, stripping everything useful from battlefields regardless of which side it came from. A dead man's shoes were just shoes. A dead man's coat was just warmth. Sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. The psychological impact of this constant degradation was profound. Men who had been raised to value cleanliness, dignity, and proper behavior found themselves living like animals. They ate with their hands, slept in their own filth, and wore clothes until they literally fell apart. The distance between civilized human being and savage became smaller every day, and through it all, they were still expected to fight, still expected to line up in neat rows when the bugle sounded and march toward enemy guns with discipline and courage, still expected to kill and die for causes that became increasingly abstract as the war ground on year after year. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How do you maintain your humanity while systematically destroying everyone else's? The answer, for many, was that you don't. You become something else entirely. Something harder, colder, more pragmatic. Something that could function in a world where death was commonplace and suffering was the natural state of existence. Something that might survive the war but could never quite become fully human again. But the real horror wasn't just what the war did to your body. It was what it did to your mind. And this is where the Civil War becomes truly terrifying, because these young men weren't just losing limbs and lives. They were losing themselves. Picture this. You're 19 years old, from a small farming community where the biggest excitement was the county fair. 6 months ago, your biggest worry was whether Sarah Miller would dance with you at the church social. Now, you're crouched in a trench outside Petersburg, listening to the enemy digging tunnels beneath your feet, knowing they're packing them with enough explosives to blow you and everyone you've ever cared about into fragments so small they'll never find enough pieces to bury. The waiting was psychological torture, hours, sometimes days, knowing that at any moment the ground beneath you might literally explode. Some men cracked completely, curling into balls and weeping like children. Others developed a 1,000-yard stare that never quite went away, even decades after the war ended. They called it soldier's heart back then. This invisible wound that left men jumpy, sleepless, haunted by ghosts only they could see. When the Battle of the Crater finally came, it was worse than anyone's nightmares. The explosion created a hole 30 feet deep and nearly 200 feet long. Union soldiers poured into this pit thinking they'd found an easy route into Confederate lines. Instead, they found themselves trapped in what became a killing field. Confederate soldiers lined the rim of the crater and shot down into the packed mass of Union troops like they were shooting fish in a barrel. One survivor described the scene: men trampling over their own wounded comrades, climbing over piles of bodies to escape the pit, screaming not from pain, but from the pure animal terror of being trapped. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who survived the crater spoke of nightmares for the rest of their lives, dreams where they were falling into endless holes while their friends' faces dissolved into blood. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was Tuesday in the Civil War. Every battle brought fresh horrors that human minds weren't designed to process. At Cold Harbor, Union forces lost 12,000 casualties in a single morning. 12,000 sons, fathers, brothers, reduced to statistics in a failed assault that everyone knew was hopeless before it began. The soldiers themselves knew it. They wrote their names and addresses on pieces of paper and pinned them to their uniforms so their bodies could be identified after the slaughter. Think about that level of fatalistic acceptance. These men marched forward knowing they were going to die, not because they were heroes, but because the alternative, being shot for cowardice, was worse. The psychological pressure was crushing. You couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't even show fear without risking court-martial and execution. So you buried your terror deep inside and kept moving forward, one mechanical step at a time. The sounds of battle weren't just loud, they were a physical assault on your sanity. The human ear isn't designed to process the thunderclap of artillery fire happening continuously for hours at a time. Soldiers' eardrums burst. They developed tinnitus that lasted for years. But worse than the physical damage was the way those sounds invaded your dreams, your quiet moments, your attempts at peace long after the fighting ended. One veteran described it perfectly. The sound of a door slamming would send me diving for cover 20 years after Appomattox. My wife thought I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. But every sudden noise brought me right back to that field outside Shiloh, waiting for the next shell to tear me apart. And then there were the smells. This is something no history book adequately captures. The olfactory nightmare of Civil War battlefields. Gunpowder smoke mixed with the copper tang of blood. The sickly sweet smell of gangrene. The overwhelming stench of human waste and death that clung to your clothes, your hair, your skin for weeks afterward. Some veterans said they could never eat certain foods again because the smell reminded them too much of rotting flesh. The intimacy of Civil War combat made everything worse. This wasn't modern warfare where you might never see your enemy clearly. These men often fought at distances where they could see each other's faces, read the expressions of the men they were trying to kill. When you bayoneted someone, you looked into their eyes as they died. When you shot someone, you watched them fall. You saw their last moments, heard their final words, witnessed the exact instant when life left their body. Many soldiers wrote about this haunting intimacy. They described dreams where the faces of men they'd killed would appear, not angry or accusing, but sad, disappointed, human. One Union soldier wrote to his sister, "I killed a boy yesterday who couldn't have been more than 16. He had freckles like Jimmy Patterson from back home. I keep seeing his face, keep wondering if his mother is still waiting for him to come home." The regimental system made this trauma even more devastating. Since entire units were recruited from the same towns and counties, soldiers often found themselves fighting alongside their childhood friends, their neighbors, their actual brothers and cousins. When someone died, it wasn't just a military casualty. It was someone whose family you knew, whose sweetheart would be waiting forever for a letter that would never come. Companies that started with 100 men from the same community might end the war with 20 survivors. If they were lucky, those 20 men carried the psychological weight of their entire hometown's grief. They were the ones who would have to go back and explain to 80 sets of parents why their sons weren't coming home. They were the ones who would see accusation in neighbors' eyes for the rest of their lives. Why did you survive when my boy didn't? The psychological coping mechanisms soldiers developed were both ingenious and heartbreaking. Many created elaborate mental compartments, storing their civilian identity in a safe place inside their minds while allowing their soldier self to do whatever was necessary to survive. They spoke of watching themselves commit acts of violence as if they were outside observers, powerless to intervene, but somehow separate from the horror. Others developed superstitions and rituals that bordered on obsessive-compulsive behavior. They would check their equipment in exactly the same order before each battle, say the same prayers, touch the same lucky charm. These rituals provided a psychological anchor, something familiar and controllable in a world gone completely insane. Religion played a complex role in soldiers' psychological survival. Many found comfort in prayer and the promise of eternal life, but others lost their faith entirely when confronted with the seemingly random nature of death and suffering. How do you maintain belief in a benevolent God when you watch good men die screaming while cowards survive unscathed? Some soldiers developed what we might now recognize as survivor's guilt long before psychologists had a name for it. They felt guilty for surviving when better men had died, guilty for the things they'd done to stay alive, guilty for the gradual numbing of their conscience that allowed them to function in combat. This guilt often manifested as reckless behavior, men taking unnecessary risks, volunteering for dangerous missions, almost daring fate to even the score. The letters soldiers wrote home reveal the careful balance they tried to maintain between honesty and protection of their family's feelings. They wrote about the weather, the food, their health, but rarely about the true horror of their experiences. How do you explain to your mother that you've become someone she wouldn't recognize? How do you tell your sweetheart that the gentle boy she kissed goodbye has been replaced by something harder and colder? One soldier wrote, "I try to remember who I was before all this, but that person feels like a stranger now. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if he was real or just someone I dreamed about." The boy who worried about failing his Latin exam seems like he lived in a different world, a softer world that doesn't exist anymore. This psychological transformation wasn't just individual, it was collective. Entire generations of American men were changed by the Civil War experience. They returned home as strangers in their own communities, carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. They struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, violent outbursts, and a persistent sense of disconnection from civilian life. Many veterans found it impossible to discuss their experiences with people who hadn't been there. How do you explain the brotherhood forged in blood to someone whose biggest crisis was a failed crop? How do you convey the intensity of combat to people who think they understand war because they've read newspaper accounts? The gap between soldier and civilian experience created a profound loneliness that lasted long after the guns fell silent. And here's the cruelest irony of all. These men who had endured unimaginable trauma were expected to simply return to their pre-war lives as if nothing had happened. There were no veterans' hospitals for psychological wounds, no therapy, no understanding that the human mind could be damaged just as surely as the human body. A man with a missing arm got sympathy and assistance. A man whose mind had been shattered was told to count his blessings and get back to work. The result was a generation of walking wounded, men who functioned in society but never truly recovered from what they'd experienced. They worked their farms, ran their businesses, raised their families, but part of them remained forever on those battlefields, forever young, forever terrified, forever changed by experiences that civilian society preferred not to acknowledge. This psychological legacy rippled through American culture for decades. The children and grandchildren of Civil War veterans grew up in households shadowed by unspoken trauma, learning to tiptoe around fathers and grandfathers who might explode into rage without warning or disappear into dark silences that lasted for days. The war didn't end in 1865. It echoed through generations of American families who never fully understood why the men who came home were so different from the ones who had left. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this psychological devastation was how completely it was ignored by the society these men had fought to preserve. The very people they had suffered to protect were uncomfortable with the evidence of that suffering. They wanted their heroes clean and noble, not broken and haunted. They wanted inspiring stories of courage and sacrifice, not the messy reality of psychological damage that couldn't be hidden beneath a uniform or disguised with a medal. So the veterans learned to suffer in silence, to carry their invisible wounds without complaint, to pretend they were fine when inside they were still fighting battles that had ended decades ago. They became masters of performance, playing the role of the grateful veteran, while their true selves remained trapped in memories of smoke and blood and the faces of boys who would never grow old. And this brings us to perhaps the most important truth about the Civil War experience. It wasn't just about North versus South, slavery versus freedom, or any of the grand political narratives we tell ourselves. At its core, it was about what happens to human beings when civilization collapses and they're forced to confront the absolute worst of what they're capable of doing to each other. The young farm boys who enlisted in 1861 thinking they were embarking on a grand adventure discovered something far more profound and terrifying. The thin line between civilization and savagery, between human and animal, between the person you think you are and the person you become when everything you believe about the world is stripped away. They discovered that when you strip away all the comforting lies society tells itself about war and honor and glory, what remains is something so fundamentally disturbing that most people spend the rest of their lives trying to forget they ever saw it. But forgetting was impossible when the evidence was carved into their bodies and burned into their minds. Take the simple act of eating, something every human being does multiple times a day without thought. For Civil War veterans, meals became psychological minefields. The texture of certain foods reminded them of human flesh. The sound of grease popping in a pan triggered flashbacks to the crackling of burning buildings with people still inside. The smell of cooking meat transported them back to field hospitals where surgeons worked by candlelight, amputating limbs while wounded men screamed. One veteran wrote decades after the war, "I haven't been able to eat pork since Antietam. Every time I see it on the plate, I remember finding my sergeant's body 3 days after the battle and what the heat had done to him. My wife thinks I'm being difficult when I push the plate away, but she doesn't understand that some memories live in your nose, in your mouth, in places where you can't reason them away." Sleep became another battleground. Veterans developed elaborate rituals around bedtime, checking locks multiple times, positioning furniture to block doorways, keeping weapons within reach. They slept facing the door, if they slept at all. Many preferred to doze in chairs rather than lie down, because horizontal positions made them feel vulnerable, exposed. The darkness that had once been a comfort became filled with phantom sounds. The rustle of canvas that might be an enemy creeping through camp. The crack of settling wood that might be a rifle being cocked. Dreams were the worst. In dreams, the psychological barriers veterans had carefully constructed during waking hours collapsed completely. They found themselves back in the trenches outside Petersburg, watching their friends disappear in clouds of red mist. They relived the moment of their first kill over and over, seeing the surprise in their victims' eyes, feeling the bayonet slide between ribs, hearing that final gasping breath. Some men stopped sleeping entirely, surviving on catnaps and coffee because unconsciousness was too dangerous. The families of these veterans paid a price too, though it took years for anyone to acknowledge it. Wives learned to approach their husbands carefully after nightmares, knowing that a gentle touch might trigger a violent reaction from a man who thought he was still fighting for his life. Children grew up walking on eggshells, never knowing what innocent comment might send their father into a rage or a depression that lasted for weeks. One soldier's daughter later wrote, "I learned early not to slam doors or drop dishes. I learned to watch Papa's face, to read the signs that meant he was going somewhere else in his mind, somewhere we couldn't follow. Mama would gather us children and whisper that we needed to be very quiet, that Papa was fighting his battles again. We didn't understand then that some battles never end. The economic impact of psychological wounds was devastating, but largely invisible. Men who had been successful farmers or craftsmen before the war found themselves unable to concentrate, unable to plan for the future, unable to trust their own judgment. They made poor business decisions, lost their tempers with customers, couldn't maintain the steady focus required for skilled work. Families that had been prosperous before the war slid into poverty, and no one understood why. Veterans often turned to alcohol as the only medicine available for psychological pain. Whiskey could quiet the nightmares, at least temporarily. It could numb the hypervigilance that made every social gathering feel like a potential ambush. It could silence the voices of dead friends who seemed to whisper accusations in quiet moments. But alcohol addiction brought its own set of problems, creating a vicious cycle where veterans drank to forget their trauma, then felt guilty about their drinking, which drove them to drink more. The next time you see one of those romantic Civil War paintings, remember what you've learned tonight. Those pristine uniforms and dignified poses weren't just artistic license. They were lies designed to make an unbearable truth palatable. The real Civil War was mud and blood and boys who never came home. It was psychological wounds that never healed and families destroyed by invisible trauma. Most importantly, it was a reminder that war doesn't create heroes. It creates survivors. And surviving changes you in ways that can never be undone. So, the next time someone tells you about the glory of war, about honor and heroism and noble sacrifice, remember the farm boys from Ohio and Virginia who thought they were signing up for adventure. Remember the 19-year-olds who wrote their names on scraps of paper before charging into certain death. Remember the veterans who spent the rest of their lives jumping at the sound of slamming doors, who couldn't eat certain foods without vomiting, who never learned how to sleep peacefully again. The Civil War wasn't just America's deadliest conflict. It was a 4-year lesson in what human beings are capable of doing to each other when civilization breaks down. It stripped away every comfortable lie we tell ourselves about war and left behind a truth so brutal that we've spent the last 160 years trying to cover it up with romantic paintings and stirring speeches about the cause. But the real cause wasn't slavery or states' rights or preserving the Union. The real cause was 600,000 dead Americans and countless more who survived in body but died in spirit. The real cause was families destroyed, minds shattered, and an entire generation of men who learned that the distance between civilized human being and savage is much shorter than anyone wants to believe. These soldiers paid the ultimate price, not just with their lives, but with their humanity. They deserve to be remembered not as romantic figures in faded photographs, but as real people who endured real horror so that we might understand the true cost of our freedoms. War isn't glorious. It isn't noble. It's just necessary sometimes. And that's the most terrifying truth of all.